Today we're going to be talking about Chapter 25, Section 3. And this is the war in the Pacific, talking about Japan. Now, in order to end the war in the Pacific, the United States wound up using a new, unheard of, deadly weapon, top secret, obviously, the atomic bomb. Now, we're going to be talking about the war against Japan. And what we have to realize is that the Japanese were winning this war. In fact, they had conquered more territory than the Nazis themselves. In the first 6 months after Pearl Harbor, Japan had managed to conquer an enormous empire. We had a limited number of military resources in the Pacific. Many of these were wiped out at Pearl Harbor. We were lucky, however, that the U.S. aircraft carriers were not affected by this invasion. And we were lucky that the U.S. submarine groups in the Pacific were not affected by this invasion. But don't get me wrong, the Japanese were winning. The Philippines had been an American colony ever since the Spanish-American War of 1898, until they were conquered by the Japanese. We had a military force stationed there under the command of General Douglas MacArthur. And in March of 1942, the U.S. and Philippine forces were trapped on the Bataan Peninsula by the Japanese army. The president was forced to order MacArthur to leave his men behind, trapped on the Bataan Peninsula of the Philippine Islands. This led us to the famous Filipino Death March, the Bataan Death March, where the Japanese captured the American army stationed there, forced this army to march across the jungle long distances. Many of our men were killed. These men were put into POW camps that were just as bad as the Holocaust concentration camps. And what you're watching is a scene from a movie called To End All Wars. You're seeing these POWs being brought into one of these Japanese camps. You're also witnessing the humiliation of these prisoners, the abuse of these prisoners, and at the end of the clip you're going to watch a method of torture known as water torture, where the Japanese would use this on disobedient prisoners. They would pump their stomachs full of water and then kick them repeatedly until their stomachs bursts. Pearl Harbor was a great Japanese military victory. It was a collateral disaster for the United States, but if it accomplished one thing, it polarized American opinion, convinced us that something had to be done. However, we were demoralized. That was the purpose of the attack. It was, very much a terrorist attack. It showed the Japanese that they could hurt the strongest country in the world. And it showed us that we could be hurt and that we could be attacked. And that's demoralizing. And so there was a need to hit them back. Well, the Japanese were surrounded by islands that were heavily fortified. They had the strongest navy. They were undefeated. And so when Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle proposed a daring raid on Tokyo itself, people thought he was insane. But he said, I can do it. I can get my planes to the Japanese capital city. I can drop bombs on the city, and I can get away. We might all get killed, but it's going to show the Japanese that we have the power to hit them, and it's going to show the American people that we can strike back even at the heart of the Japanese. Everybody was like, you're crazy. And so we had to outfit these special planes. We had to strip them down of everything except for enough fuel and the bombs to get there. In fact, the plan was so crazy that Doolittle even knew that he wouldn't make it back. And all of these pilots volunteered to join him on this raid. And they knew they wouldn't make it back. They flew somehow under the cover of night, made it to Japan. That means they had to fly past the Japanese Navy. They had to fly past all these islands surrounding Japan, and they had to get to the mainland of Japan, and they had to drop their bombs on Tokyo. But we had to do this partly because of what you're seeing. The Japanese were notorious for using terrorist techniques. They were brutal in their treatment of captives. They were a fanatical empire that had to be stopped. And Doolittle's raid accomplished what was thought to be impossible. He managed to bomb the capital city of Japan at the height of its empire and then escape. Now, the crash landed over China, and from there they made their long journey back to the United States. Not all did make it, but some did. Now the Battle of the Coral Sea. In May of 1942, this undefeated Japanese Navy was steaming towards Australia. And their track record showed they would have conquered the island continent of Australia. But this time the United States was involved. And the U.S. Navy, with the ability to crack the Japanese code, knew where they were going, when they were going to be there. And we arrived precisely at the same time as them, and we stopped the Japanese invasion of Australia. And this was the first defeat that the Japanese had ever been dealt. Next, undaunted from their defeat at the Coral Sea, the Japanese Navy was planning on conquering the tiny island of Midway, just northwest of the islands of Hawaii. This would give them a base from which to launch a full-scale invasion of the United States. I kid you not, they were going to invade us. And yet again, we stopped them. This time, quite decisively. We destroyed most of their aircraft carriers, most of their navy, crippling their offensive abilities. This was the largest naval battle in the history of warfare. Admiral of the U.S. Navy at this time was Chester Nimitz. Paramount to our victory was the ability to crack the Japanese code, yet again to know their tactics, to intercept their communications, and to utilize them to our full advantage. And so, after the Battle of Midway, with their offensive ability crippled, the Japanese would be put on the defensive for the rest of the war.
In June.
And so this great victory allowed the Allies to go on the offensive. This was called the Island Hopping Campaign, because Japan, as an archipelago, is a collection of thousands of islands. Now the mainland, where Tokyo is surrounded by all of these islands. And the Japanese had these places fortified. Some of the most heavily fortified places on the planet were these Japanese islands, full of fanatical defenders ready to fight to the death. The first island we landed on was Guadalcanal. And it was here that we defeated the Japanese for the first time on land. You can watch the movie made about it. I can't recall the name. I'll tell you later. And it described a tropical hell where cholera, yellow fever, malaria, typhus, trench foot, heavy rains, horrible conditions that these soldiers were forced to fight through, that the Japanese were adept at. But yet here we defeated the Japanese for the very first time on land. The next island was Leyte Island. And it was here at the Philippines that MacArthur was able to return and rescue the soldiers that had been captured under his command. And he made the famous statement, and I quote, "I have returned." Now, it's also important to note that these islands that were heavily fortified, where the Japanese were dug in, at each of these islands, the Japanese defenders fought to the death. So you think island after island of Thermopylae after Thermopylae. Each Japanese defender was prepared to die in the defense. In fact, one Japanese soldier who was too wounded to kill himself remarked that he witnessed the ceremony of the ritual suicide of two of the generals at Guadalcanal. He said, and I quote, "With a flash and a shout, the last great service of these generals to their emperor was performed." They killed themselves simultaneously by stabbing themselves, disemboweling, and then dropping.
It's called seppuku.
Seppuku. It's supposed to be performed without a show of pain, without a show of fear. The Japanese were willing to do everything. In fact, one example of this for the kamikaze. The word kamikaze means divine wind. It's a hark back to when a great typhoon wiped out the Mongol fleet that was going to invade and conquer Japan in the 1300s. So these Japanese suicide bombers called themselves the kamikaze. They would load their planes with explosives, and they would crash them into American ships. These were the first guided missiles that we've seen in the history of combat. It's difficult to stop these planes because their objective was not to survive. Their objective is to crash into enemy planes, and they caused great destruction. But at the Battle of Lake Gulf, despite numerous suicide attacks and fanatical stubbornness, the Japanese were defeated yet again. And at the Lake Gulf battle, the Japanese Navy was crippled. And again, as their offensive abilities were devastated, so now were the Navy's defensive capabilities. And now two of the most critical islands in the island hopping campaign, Iwo Jima and Okinawa, considered the two most heavily fortified places on the planet. You're watching a clip from the movie Flags of Our Fathers showing the invasion of Iwo Jima. In fact, when we go to Washington, D.C., we'll see the monument to the U.S. Marines, the famous raising of the flag. It was at this battle where that photograph was taken. Iwo Jima was a critical base because it had a landing strip upon which many of these kamikaze pilots were taking off and crashing into U.S. ships. It had artillery capable of firing from land to sea to attack our ships. It was imperative that this island had to be taken by the United States before an invasion on the mainland could be attempted. But as you're seeing in the clip, the invasion was a difficult one. The U.S. Marines landed onto what was then nicknamed Sulphur Island. This volcanic soil absorbed artillery shells from our warships. And so the U.S. Marines had to land into a hot zone and incur casualties at a higher rate than we had experienced so far in the Second World War. Some units were wiped out entirely, fighting against only 20,700 Japanese defenders. And of these defenders, only 200 survived, most of which were too wounded to kill themselves. The U.S. Marines reported scenes of mass suicides where the Japanese would run off cliffs together. They would go into bonsai charges where they would raise samurai swords and charge at machine guns. These people were willing to die to defend their cause. And insisted on it, in fact. They would target medics because they knew that to kill a medic would also kill any that they might render assistance to. They were willing to do anything necessary to kill as many as possible. And so what you're watching here is the Japanese defenders are about to unleash on these U.S. Marines. Now the same occurred at Okinawa. Marines invaded this island. The same tactic, to bomb the island and then to land and take the island. Okinawa was an even larger defeat for the Japanese. 110,000 Japanese defenders, again, fought to the death against the U.S. Marines, incurring at the same time some of the highest casualty rates we've experienced. But again, note their casualties. If anything, this island hopping campaign convinced us that if we are to mount a full invasion of the mainland of Japan, it would incur as many as 1.5 million casualties. Because the Japanese have shown now that they are willing to fight to the death on every island we go to. I mean, the mainland of Japan has, at this time, close to 100 million people. And imagine an island of 100 million people willing to fight to the death. In fact, intelligence reported that civilians were being trained to fight, even with spears and swords. And so, if anything, this island hopping campaign convinced us that an atomic bomb was necessary. And so now back to the Manhattan Project. The head of this project was J. Robert Oppenheimer, an American physicist. We had successfully tested an atomic weapon in the New Mexico desert by July of 1945. President Truman had not even been told of this project when he was vice president. It was so secret that only the president and those involved in the project knew. But when FDR passed and Truman was appointed president in his stead, he was then told of this top secret project which could possibly end the war. Truman did not hesitate to use this device against the Japanese, and now that we have secured an open route to the Japanese mainland, he decided to drop these bombs. On August 6th of 1945, the Enola Gay plane, it was called the Enola Gay, dropped the first of these bombs, nicknamed Big Boy, on a Japanese military center on the mainland of Japan at Hiroshima. Over 100,000 people were killed in an instant, and the largest bomb that has ever been used in the history of warfare. The Japanese were stubborn, however. They refused to surrender, and so 3 days later, we dropped a second bomb on a population center, this time at Nagasaki. And so the god emperor, who was revered and worshipped by his people, Hirohito, broken by the devastation that he had witnessed upon his own people, announced the official surrender of Japan unconditionally to the Allied powers on September 2nd of 1945. So now back to the Manhattan Project. The head of this project was J. Robert Oppenheimer, an American physicist. we had successfully tested an atomic weapon in the New Mexico desert by July of 1945. President Truman had not even been told of this project when he was vice president. It was so secret that only the president and those involved in the project knew. But when FDR passed and Truman was appointed president in his stead, he was then told of this top secret project which could possibly end the war. Truman did not hesitate to use this device against the Japanese, and now that we have secured an open route to the Japanese mainland, he decided to drop these bombs. On August 6th of 1945, the Enola Gay plane, it was called the Enola Gay, dropped the first of these bombs, nicknamed Big Boy, on a Japanese military center on the mainland of Japan at Hiroshima. Over 100,000 people were killed in an instant, and the largest bomb that has ever been used in the history of warfare. The Japanese were stubborn, however. They refused to surrender, and so 3 days later, we dropped a second bomb on a population center, this time at Nagasaki. And so the god emperor, who was revered and worshipped by his people, Hirohito, broken by the devastation that he had witnessed upon his own people, announced the official surrender of Japan unconditionally to the Allied powers on September 2nd of 1945. So thank God the war was over. Now the difficult task of deciding what to do. We've never seen anything like this, and I really hope we never see anything like this again. It makes for a good movie, but it's a terrible thing when you think about it. And so the three most powerful leaders of the Allies, FDR, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin, met in February of 1945, just a few months before FDR passed. And it was their hope to discuss what the war would look like, what the world would look like after the war. And so, at the Yalta conference, Roosevelt and Churchill agreed to a concession. That Germany would be temporarily divided into four parts. That France, Britain, and the United States would oversee three of the four parts, but that one of the parts would be overseen by the Soviet Union. In return, Stalin promised that he would allow free elections in Eastern Europe and that he would assist in fighting the Japanese. Because at this time we weren't sure the bomb would be ready. In fact, it wasn't successfully tested until July of that same year. And so we were still planning this full-scale invasion of Japan. And you can imagine how terrible that would have been. And so we were going to need every able-bodied soldier that we could. Now, FDR hoped to get support for a conference to establish the United Nations because he hoped, like his predecessor, Woodrow Wilson, that this would be the war to end all wars. The human cost of this war is staggering. It was the most destructive war in human history. It was a terrible thing. Estimates are that 60 million people perished in this conflict. We may never know the full extent because, well, it's simply another part of the 20th century. And from that came the Cold War, where millions more died. And from that came the instability that we have today. We're still dealing with the repercussions of the 20th century. Now, following the war, a great tribunal was held called the Nuremberg Trials. 24 of the top Nazi leaders that survived were tried and sentenced with crimes against humanity, charged with crimes against the peace and war crimes committed that violated basic human rights. A statement issued from one of the judges of the case said, and I quote, "The consequences levied on these individuals is insignificant. However, the precedent set that humans are responsible for their own actions regardless of where they are committed is important to future generations." It established the principle that people are responsible for their own actions, even in war, no matter where they are on the planet, they are responsible to humanity for the things they do. Meanwhile, Japan was occupied by U.S. forces. Over 1,100 Japanese people were tried and sentenced. Hirohito was tried and sentenced to death, but he committed suicide before it could be carried out. The Japanese were also tried with crimes against humanity. The Japanese government was reshaped under U.S. direction. A democratic constitution was established. In fact, in honor of General Douglas MacArthur, it's still called the MacArthur Constitution today. The Japanese government became a democracy and has flourished. And I'm sure you like their products.